Well, guys, this is it. Good morning, everybody. This is the TSMU fan here, and today we will be reviewing the Thomas movie Big World, Big Adventures. The last ever Thomas movie and the last movie written by Andrew Brenner. Now let's not waste any time. You guys all want to know what I think about this movie, so let's just jump right on in. The plot of this movie is that Thomas is bored of all his usual work and wants to see the world. He is eventually convinced to do so by a visiting race car called Ace, who is also traveling around the world to compete in different races around the globe. So Thomas just decides of his own will to follow Ace and arrives in Africa. From there, Thomas meets an African tank engine who is named Nia, and she sticks around with him on his journey. Meanwhile, Sir Topham Hatt is very worried about where Thomas might have gone off to, so he follows him to Africa and tries to catch up with him, but to no avail. Eventually, after going on a lot of adventures in various different countries such as Colombia, the United States, and Brazil, Thomas finally returns home to Sodor. However, as he's about to return home, Nia tells him that she doesn't have a home in Africa to return to, even though she looks like she's in perfect condition and seems to be taken care of well. So Thomas and Nia return home and everyone gives them a warm welcome home, even though they were worried about him earlier and probably had to do all of his jobs along with their own without any warning. The movie ends showing an exhausted Sir Topham Hatt on a ship, where he asks someone if they've seen Thomas, and it's revealed that the character that he asked was none other than Ace the race car. Yup, that's literally how this movie ends. Anyways, you all know just how bad this movie is. So just like with my Misty Island Rescue review, I'm going to start off with all the good qualities that this movie had first, and then move on to what I didn't like about this movie. The absolute best thing about this movie, by far, is the concept. The concept of Thomas traveling around the world to all these different countries is actually a really interesting concept, and it's realistic too, considering engines such as the Flying Scotsman have been to America and Australia on tours. I definitely like the concept of Thomas taking a big worldwide tour, but the movie doesn't really deliver on that concept in a fun and interesting way. It just seems like they tried to shove Thomas into as many countries as they could in the time slot that they had available to them, and that really sucks. But we're not talking about the bad stuff yet, we're talking about the good stuff! So let's move on to another thing that I liked about this movie, and that is Thomas himself. Thomas is actually pretty close to being like classic Thomas in this movie, and being cheeky to Gordon by coupling his fish train onto Gordon's Express definitely feels like something that Thomas would do. I also love how Thomas interacts with Nia in this movie. He is absolutely not interested in having her help whatsoever, and considering what they did with Nia later in the series, I definitely feel like Thomas is really relatable here, always being grumpy over Nia and how she's always following him around wherever he goes. Now, since I mentioned Nia, she's actually sort of a positive in this movie, surprisingly enough. She doesn't feel forced or anything like she does in the show, and I love how she retorts what other characters say to her right back at them. I also love how she's the one who comes up with the plan to have the rainwater funnel into Thomas's tank when they're in the rainforest. That was actually a pretty clever idea of hers, but in reality it would take a lot longer for Thomas's tank to completely fill up with water than what they showed in the movie. While I do kind of like how Nia was handled in this movie, how she was handled in the show is a whole different discussion entirely, which I am not going to cover in this video. This video is specifically reviewing the movie, and not the whole series that would follow it. Speaking of Nia, another thing that I liked about this movie was the diversity in voice actors. I appreciate this movie for having Nia actually be voiced by a voice actor from Kenya. That's a really nice touch. But it's not just Nia. The entire rest of the international characters that we meet along the way in this movie show a really diverse voice cast, which I really appreciate, and I'm glad that this movie wasn't lazy enough to reuse voice actors for the international characters. Anyways, now let's talk about Lightning McQueen. I mean Ace the race car. I kind of like how Ace was handled in this movie, and I really like how he's sort of a bad influence on Thomas. He convinces Thomas to do things that Thomas eventually realizes throughout the course of the movie are wrong. And when Thomas does finally realize that Ace is being a bad influence towards him, he He takes him to the salt flats where he was supposed to be going and just leaves him there. This was handled very well in my opinion, and I don't think that there was really a better way that they could have sent him off in this movie. Another thing that I really liked about this movie were the returning characters. When Thomas is in China, he meets up with Yong Bao, who we haven't seen since the Great Race, and it's really nice how he plays a little bit of a part in this movie considering he didn't do much or even say anything in the Great Race itself. Also, when Thomas is passing through America, he passes Sam, a big green tender engine that was a part of the Sodor Stories collection, had his own promotional video released on the official Thomas & Friends YouTube channel along with Logan. I really wish that we could have seen more with Sam in this movie, as his only real appearances were in the promotional videos that they made of him. Maybe he could be the engine that gets help for Thomas so that he can get back on the tracks instead of Bew, I don't know. Speaking of Bew, I love the idea of Thomas coming across this old cowboy era steam engine that helps him out. And interestingly, the early storyboards of Bew's scenes in this movie depict him as a gray tank engine with a cow catcher, and his design in these early storyboards is very similar to that of Puffa from Thomas's sister's show, Tugs. That's definitely very interesting, and it brings up a question that I've been wondering about for a while now. In the episode New Crane on the Dock, at the end of the episode, Big Mickey, the giant crane at Brendam Docks next to Cranky, suddenly gains a face, which he had not had in any of the seasons before. In this episode, he is called specifically by the name he had in Tugs.
Dock lights help Big Mickey transfer explosives to the naval tramper Krakatoa.
You've been standing there silent all these years, Big Mickey!
Does this mean that Thomas and Tugs take place in the same universe? I mean, the Fulton Ferry does end up appearing at the end of Gordon and the Gremlin from Season 5, and we've also got that rumor that the Tugs characters were supposed to appear in Thomas and the Magic Railroad as a part of a scene where Thomas passes them by the seaside, so I guess they are in the same universe together. Huh. Well, I guess that's mostly about it for all the good qualities that this movie has. So now it's time to move on to what you've all been waiting for. The bad stuff about Big World, Big Adventures. Get ready, because there is a lot to talk about here. Alright, let's get into it. The absolute worst thing about this movie, by far, is that, well, it's just extremely boring. The movie starts out alright, I guess. It's very similar to Misty Island Rescue in a way, where Thomas gets lost in a new place and everyone on Sodor is worried about him. But once Thomas reaches these new countries, nothing actually happens. Thomas just pulls goods trains throughout all of these different places, and they don't really spend a whole lot of time in these places either. There's a scene in this movie where Nia tells Thomas about the Rainbow Mountains in China, and Thomas is very interested in seeing them for himself. But once he finally gets to them, he couldn't care less about them because he's too busy singing some stupid song that I absolutely cannot stand to listen to in the slightest. I actually think that freaking Misty Island Rescue did a better job of showing off what was in the new locations than this movie. And that just goes to show how bad this thing is. The fact that I'm even saying that Misty Island Rescue, the absolute worst Thomas movie of them all, did something better than this movie is really bad. But I'll get into that discussion later in this review. Another thing that I didn't like about this movie that I mentioned earlier was the songs. This is the only Thomas movie that I have seen where I absolutely despise all of the songs in this movie. Where in the World is Thomas is just one big gigantic pander to the hardcore fans watching, with them pulling out every single reference to another Thomas episode that they could think of. Plus, it's just a cheap knockoff of Where is Thomas from The Great Discovery. Wake Up is decent, I guess? I like the inclusion of the African language in this song, but that's really the only good thing about it other than the singing voices for the trucks. I don't even think it can really count in Da Ulale as a song because it doesn't really have a dedicated music video to accompany it. It's just a song that the trucks sing to get an elephant off the tracks that Thomas runs into. We're Friends would be the most annoying song of this entire movie if it wasn't for a different song later that would follow it. But anyways, this song is just the most boring, bland, and surface level kids show song that I think I have ever heard in Thomas. The next song is Free and Easy, and I think that I can say that this is probably the best song of the movie, but the fact that this movie only has one memorable song is not very good. All of the other Thomas movies at least had songs that were catchy and memorable, such as The Great Race and Journey Beyond Sodor, but this movie literally has only one good song, and that's a problem. But there's something else about this song that makes this song even worse than it already is. So there was actually a deleted scene in this song that didn't make it into the final movie. Part of it does, and it's the section of the song where Ace meets Carlos from The Great Race. Apparently in this deleted scene, Ace mentions that he follows the sun, and Carlos mistakes him thinking that he is a sun worshipper. Carlos then shows Ace what the sun worshippers looked like by what the wiki says is apparently the Aztec calendar around his face. This of course makes Ace uncomfortable, and he waits anxiously for the signal to turn green. Who the heck at Mattel thought that this was a good idea to put this scene in the movie? This deleted scene is absolutely racist! But it's not just that. It also shows that the writing crew were not doing a whole lot of research on the countries that appear in this movie, which explains why America just looks like a stereotypical Wild West desert, why Brazil just looks like a rainforest, and so on. They were just using the first thing that comes to mind when you think of these countries, and that's just bad! They should have expanded a lot more on these locations and not just make them look like the most stereotypical things about them, because honestly, there's a lot more to these countries than what you think of them on the surface. It's like they say, don't judge a book by its cover, huh? Anyways, moving on. The next song in the movie is the absolute worst song of this entire movie, and that song is Sometimes You Make a Friend. This song is legit the most annoying song in this movie, as it's just some sappy song where Thomas sings about how he shouldn't have listened to Ace and played a trick on Nia. This is sort of the last song of this movie too, as I am not counting the reprise of We're Friends that plays at the end of the movie. Overall, the songs in this movie are just really dull, and none of them are really all that memorable. Anyways, let's move on. Another bad thing that I noticed about this movie was that the entire movie could have been prevented if Sir Topham Hatt was actually smart. In the Where in the World is Thomas song, Emily straight up tells Sir Topham Hatt where Thomas went. She mentions that Carly loaded him onto a ship headed for Africa. If Sir Topham Hatt was actually more intelligent in this movie, he would have thought ahead and called the port Thomas was going to and tell them to bring him back home to Sodor. Just like Misty Island Rescue, this plot hole affects the entirety of the movie, and it just makes it even more boring and dull than it already is. I also don't like the animation in this movie either. I mentioned how badly the animation looked in jam-filled later episodes and specials in my Journey Beyond Sodor review, but the weird thing is that apparently the animation didn't look like this during production? We have gotten some leaks of early scenes in this movie, some of them featuring Nia in an earlier design, which I think actually looks kind of better than her final design. Her final design just makes her look way too much like a Shima from The Great Race. But anyways, we're not talking about Nia, we're talking about the animation. The animation in these leak scenes looks very similar to the animation style from Journey Beyond Sodor, and it looks 100 times better than the animation that we end up seeing in the final movie. I don't get why Jam Phil decided against the animation looking realistic and instead decided on making everything look way too shiny and weirdly lit. Speaking of the animation, another thing that I didn't like about this movie, and this also applies to the series as well, is that most of the locations in the different countries are just redressed Sodor locations. That one station that Thomas meets young Bao at is just Maithwaite but different. The docks at Dar es Salaam where Thomas and Nia deliver the trucks to is just a heavily modified Brendam, and this shunting yard in India is just Knapford's shunting yard but with palm trees. I guess the old saying of, it doesn't matter where you go, you've never left, really applies here in this movie, huh? Anyways, another thing that I absolutely did not like about this movie was how unrealistically everything was handled. For example, why does Thomas do a freaking loop-de-loop when he derails in his runaway sequence while in the United States? What the heck is this? Do you not understand how gravity works? And how the heck does he somehow get back on the tracks after that? Oh my gosh, this is literally infuriating me. And we've only just begun, folks. The Free and Easy music video is also incredibly unrealistic. Why are the cars doing that? How is Ace carrying the trucks and Thomas like that? Fortunately, unlike Journey Beyond Sodor, this movie does not make any references to the songs that any of the other characters sing, which means that these songs are all set outside the reality of the movie. But even then, what the heck is happening here? There's such a thing as getting too obscure, you know? I also have to mention the bouncing in this movie, since I think it's actually worse in this movie than it is in Journey Beyond Sodor, which is saying something. Why are the trucks tipping sideways like that? Also, Ace is literally animated like a character from Cars in a lot of scenes. But the difference between this movie and Cars is that Cars was not supposed to be realistic. Thomas, however, started out as a realistic series about real trains doing things that were sometimes inspired by real-life railway-related events that happened in the past. Looking back at Magic Railroad and watching this movie, it's kind of amazing just how badly Thomas had devolved over the years. Sure, it did have a spike in quality, but that's really only because Mattel hired people who actually cared about this show and its legacy to write the stories. And this movie wasn't even the end of Thomas's de-evolution either. Literally, how did we go from the show being animated with CGI to being animated in 2D? It's just absolutely baffling to me, and I'll never understand why Mattel made that switch in the first place. Anyways, I think that might just be everything wrong with this movie. So now let's move on to what the miscellaneous things I noticed in this movie were. Probably the biggest thing that I noticed from looking on the wiki is that apparently an official Thomas and Friends magazine said that Thomas meets Rebecca on the mainland in this movie, and this was most likely dropped during production of the movie. I have to say, I actually really wish that they did put this in the movie, because as it is in the series, Rebecca appears out of pretty much nowhere and doesn't have a good introduction to her. If Thomas were to meet her while on his way back to Sodor with Nia, and if they hinted at the fact that she will be coming to Sodor soon, that would have been a much better introduction to her than what the show gave us. Another interesting thing that I honestly never noticed when I watched the movie for the first time is that this is the only Thomas and Friends production that does not have a narrator to narrate the story at all. In the next seasons that would follow this movie, the narrator would be written out completely and Thomas would be the one narrating the stories to the audience from his point of view. While I do think that this could be an interesting concept if it was handled right, like maybe while Thomas is narrating he makes fun of a character when they do something bad or something like that, it just doesn't really work. Thomas has always had a third-person narrator telling the stories, and while I do see where they were coming from with the idea of Thomas narrating the stories, as he did tell the story of Duke to the other engines in both Grand Puff and Sleeping Beauty from Season 4, I just think that Thomas as the narrator doesn't feel right. But that's talking about the series. And like I said earlier, we're not covering the series here, we're specifically covering the movie. So let's move on to another thing that I noticed, being that this is the longest Thomas movie of them all, with a total runtime of 85 minutes. Interesting that The Adventure Begins, the absolute best Thomas movie of them all, is the shortest movie of them all, while one of the worst movies of the franchise's history is the longest movie of them all. Interesting. Another thing that I noticed was that when Nia gets caught up in the avalanche and Thomas tries to save her, Thomas's whistle fluctuates in pitch when he's whistling for help. Don't you dare! Don't you dare reference that episode! We don't talk about that one! Anyways, another thing that I noticed from looking on the wiki is that this movie scored a 20% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is a movie rating site, and it's the lowest score of any Thomas movie. You see? I said in my Magic Railroad review that that movie was not as bad as people made it out to be, and just to compare, that movie got a 21% on Rotten Tomatoes. While that is still pretty low, and is just one number above Big World, Big Adventures, it still proves my point that Thomas and the Magic Railroad wasn't as bad as people really made it seem like it was. Speaking of comparing this movie to other Thomas movies that performed poorly, let's now move on to the question that I posed earlier in this video. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that the fact that Misty Island Rescue does something better than this movie says a lot about just how bad this movie is. So, is this movie better than Misty Island Rescue, the worst Thomas movie of them all? I'd have to say yes, but only barely. This movie is honestly right next to Misty Island Rescue in terms of the worst Thomas movies I have ever seen. And with that, I don't think that there's really anything else to mention about this movie, as the rest of the trivia on the wiki isn't really all that interesting. So I think I'm going to end this video here. This movie was horrendous. That's the word that I'd use to describe this movie. I described Journey Beyond Sodor as okay at the end of my review video on that movie, so if I had to choose any word to sum up this movie, it would be horrendous. This movie was the real start to the second downfall of Thomas and Friends. The downfall that was so bad that it literally ended up killing the series. Because of this, many people consider this to be the worst Thomas movie of them all. But as I stated earlier, in my opinion, I think that Misty Island Rescue was the worst movie. Even though Misty Island Rescue does do something better than this movie, it's still a bad movie that I feel deserves the bottom spot as the worst movie of them all. But enough about Misty Island Rescue. This movie, by itself, was just plain bad, with nothing really in it that felt inspired. And with this movie came the downfall of the whole series. So bad to the point that Mattel had to reboot it. This movie was an absolutely terrible look into Thomas's eventual downfall, as the show would never again be the same after this movie. And with that, that's the end of my 75th anniversary review-a-thon. There are officially no other Thomas movies left to be reviewed after this one. And before anyone asks, no, I am not going to be reviewing the All Engines Go movie Race for the Sodor Cup. Just like the Grinch, I am not touching All Engines Go with a 39.5-foot pole. My 75th anniversary review-a-thon ends here. Since we finally reached the end of my 75th anniversary review-a-thon, allow me to tell you where all 14 Thomas movies rank for me. In the number 1 spot is of course The Adventure Begins. Number 2 is Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. Number 3 is Blue Mountain Mystery. Number 4 is The Great Discovery. Number 5 is Tale of the Brave. Number 6 is Hero of the Rails. Number 7 is Journey Beyond Sodor. Number 8 is King of the Railway. Number 9 is Thomas and the Magic Railroad. Number 10 is The Great Race. Number 11 is Calling All Engines. Number 12 is Day of the Diesels. Number 13 is Big World Big Adventures. And number 14 is Misty Island Rescue. I really hope that you all enjoyed listening to me talk about all 14 Thomas movies in depth in their own review videos. And now that this series is over, I don't really know what to make next in terms of review videos. I do have a couple projects of my own that I've been inspired to make, so those will be coming out soon. But after that, I don't really have any ideas on what to make next in terms of review videos. So if you guys have any suggestions on things that you'd want me to review, you can either drop them in the comments below, or you can become a $5 or higher Patreon supporter on my Patreon, which is linked on my YouTube channel's banner. Happy 75th anniversary, Thomas and Friends. Although by the time I finished writing this review, that sentence is extremely belated, as in the time it's taken me to get through my 75th anniversary review-a-thon, we've already celebrated Thomas's 76th anniversary. But anyways, I'm happy that I can finally end this and move on to whatever the next big review video is going to be on my channel. So if you're interested in seeing what I have to cover next in terms of review videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Anyways, I think I've rambled on for long enough. I'll see you all in the next video, and thanks so much for watching and sticking with me on this journey reviewing all 14 Thomas movies. This is the TSMU fan, signing out. Special thanks to a patron of mine who has chosen to remain anonymous. If you'd like to learn how to get your name at the end of every new video that I upload, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I've linked it on my YouTube channel's banner.